The man who dragged Madeline Pryor from the smoking ruins of the stagecoach wasn't a man at all. He was a ghost. They called him Jonah Wade, the war chief, a name earned in the blood and smoke of a war that had ended years ago, but still lived in his eyes. He was a broken shell, driven by a rage that had consumed his soul. He took her as a hostage, a piece of cargo to be bartered. But he never planned on her. He never planned on the quiet strength that would defy his darkness, or the tears that would expose the one thing he thought he'd lost forever, his heart. The high desert wind was a restless spirit, whipping dust against the windows of the Butterfield stagecoach. Inside, Madeline Pryor held a small leather-bound book of poetry, her knuckles white. She wasn't reading. She was tracing the route on a map in her mind, a red line that led from the ashes of her old life in Missouri to the promise of a new one in Redemption Creek. She was to be the town's new school mom, a new start, a clean slate. The other passengers were a grim collection, a portly banker named Mr. Hemlock, a nervous young priest clutching a rosary, and a gambler with a silver-tipped cane who hadn't said 2 words since dawn. The first shot was a sharp crack, like a branch snapping in a fire. The second slammed into the coach's frame, sending splinters flying. Mr. Hemlock screamed. "They're upon us!" the driver bellowed from above. The coach lurched, horses screaming in terror. Madeline was thrown from her seat, landing in a heap against the gambler. The world outside became a storm of hoofbeats, war cries, and gunfire. The stage rocked violently, and then, with a sound of splintering wood and animal panic, it crashed onto its side, sliding several feet in the grit. Silence, thick and heavy, lasted only a second before the doors were ripped open. The man who stood there blotted out the sun. He was tall, dressed in a mix of worn cavalry blues and rough-spun leather. A heavy beard, matted with dust, covered a face that looked carved from the granite. But it was his eyes. They were the color of a winter sky, empty and cold. He held a Colt revolver with a steadiness that was almost inhuman. "Out!" he barked. Mr. Hemlock scrambled out, hands high. "Take the strongbox, take it all, we're unarmed." A second man, leaner and with a cruel twist to his lips, laughed. This one was Cass Boone. "We know, fat man. Shut your hole." The raiders, there were 5 of them, were efficient. They were not just bandits. They were predators. They disarmed the driver and shotgun guard, tossing them to the ground. Cass Boone found the strongbox and shattered the lock with his boot. Jonah Wade, their leader, scanned the passengers. His gaze was dismissive, sweeping over them as if they were livestock. Then his eyes landed on Madeline. She was pushing herself up, her hat gone, her auburn hair spilling over her shoulders. She was terrified, but she refused to grovel. She met his gaze. It was a mistake. That flicker of defiance, that spark of life in the midst-prix of their ruin, seemed to snag on something inside him. He stared at her for a long, unbearable moment. "We don't take hostages, Wade," Cass said, stuffing gold certificates into his satchel. "Adds weight, leaves a trail." "This one we do," Jonah said. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together. "Why?" Cass sneered. "She pretty, ain't she? Got plans for her?" Jonah moved faster than a snake. He crossed the space in 2 strides and backhanded Cass across the face. The crack of the blow echoed in the sudden quiet. Cass stumbled, spitting blood, his hand flying to his knife. "She is my decision," Jonah stated, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. He didn't even look at Cass. His dead eyes were still locked on Madeline. "You question me again, Cassidy, and I'll leave you for the vultures." Cass Boone, his face a mask of murder, slowly lowered his hand. He knew the threat was real. Jonah Wade turned back to Madeline. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a steel trap, and hauled her to her feet. "You ride with me. Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I have no money. I'm a teacher." "I don't care what you are," he snarled, dragging her toward his horse, a massive black stallion that watched them with wild eyes. "Your leverage." He threw her onto the saddle, mounting behind her with an agile movement that belied his size. He wrapped one arm around her waist, pinning her against his chest. She could feel the hard muscle beneath the worn coat, smell the dust, leather, and the faint, bitter scent of old grief. "What about them?" another gang member, a young man named Luke, asked, gesturing to the other passengers. "Leave them," Jonah commanded. "We're done here." He spurred the stallion, and the world dissolved into a brutal, pounding rhythm as they left the wreckage and the terrified survivors behind, riding hard toward the jagged, blood-red mesas of the Badlands. Madeline Pryor, the school marm, was now the property of the war chief. The ride was a blur of misery. Jonah Wade's gang rode for hours without speaking, pushing their horses through a landscape that looked like a scar on the earth. They navigated treacherous canyons and dry riverbeds, the sun a relentless hammer. Madeline was strapped to Jonah, her back pressed against his chest. She felt every beat of his heart, a slow, heavy thud that felt less like life and more like a muffled drum beating a funeral dirge. He said nothing to her. He didn't offer her water. He didn't adjust his grip. She was cargo. When they finally made camp, it was in a deep, shadowed canyon, known only to them as the Devil's Throat. The walls rose 1,000 feet on either side, a natural fortress. Jonah dismounted and pulled her down after him. Her legs, numb and weak, buckled. She would have collapsed if he hadn't held her arm. He shoved her toward a small, dry cave set into the canyon wall. "Stay there. Don't make a sound." She huddled in the darkness, watching the men. They were a study in brokenness. There was Luke, the youngest, who couldn't be more than 20. He kept glancing at her, a look of profound discomfort on his face. There was a burly man named Dutch, who seemed to operate on simple, brutish instinct. And there was Cass Boone. Cass was the most dangerous. While Jonah was a block of ice, Cass was a bonfire. He kept watching Madeline, his eyes lingering, a predatory smile playing on his lips. He was enjoying this. Jonah Wade, however, seemed to take no pleasure in any of it. He sat apart from his men, staring into the small fire, his face a mask of stone. He looked, Madeline thought, like a man waiting for a firing squad. Later, Luke brought her a canteen and a piece of hardtack. You should eat," he mumbled, avoiding her eyes. "Why?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Why is he doing this? What does he want?" Luke flinched. "Best you don't ask, Mom. Just do what he says. Don't talk to Cass, and don't provoke the captain." "Captain?" "Wade. Jonah Wade. He was a captain in the war," Luke whispered, before scurrying away, as if the words themselves were dangerous. Madeline's terror began to curdle into a strange, sharp curiosity. A captain. This brutal outlaw was a soldier. That night, the cold was as biting as the fear. Madeline wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the cave. The men took turns on watch. She heard them muttering, the conversation dominated by Cass Boone's low, gravelly voice. "Don't know why he took her. She's just trouble. Ought to finish it. Or at least have some fun with her." "Shut your mouth, Cass." Jonah's voice cut through the dark, sharp and sudden. "She's not for you. She's not for anyone. She's insurance. That's all." "Insurance for what, Wade? We got enough gold to last a year. What are you waiting for? For Sheriff Brody to make his move?" Jonah replied. "He's been on our tail since Santa Fe. He'll want the girl back. He'll be predictable, and when he comes, we'll be waiting." A cold realization washed over Madeline. She wasn't leverage for money. She was bait. She was the cheese in a trap set for the law. Later, deep in the night, a sound startled her from a fitful doze. It was a strangled cry, a sound of pure agony, cut short. It came from Jonah. She peeked from the cave. He was on his bedroll near the dying fire, sitting bolt upright. His body was rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was breathing hard, a sheen of cold sweat on his face in the moonlight. He was having a nightmare. He looked tormented, his eyes wide and staring at shadows that weren't there. He looked broken. "Are you all right?" The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. They were quiet. Barely a whisper. His head snapped toward her. The tormented look vanished, replaced instantly by that glacial, terrifying rage. He was on his feet and in the cave in an instant, his large frame filling the entrance. He grabbed the front of her dress, hauling her to her feet. "You speak when I tell you to speak," he hissed, his face inches from hers. She could see the war he'd mentioned reflected in his pupils. It wasn't over for him. It was happening right now. "You were shouting," she said, trembling but forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I don't shout," he snarled. "You were in pain." That stopped him. His grip tightened for a second, then faltered. He stared at her, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile her words with the world of violence he inhabited. He saw her, not as leverage, not as a woman, but as a witness to his weakness. He shoved her back, and she stumbled against the rock wall. "You saw nothing," he ordered. "You heard nothing. Go to sleep." He turned and stalked back to his bedroll, but he didn't lie down. He sat with his back to her, a rigid silhouette against the fading embers, keeping watch over his demons for the rest of the night. They stayed in the devil's throat for 3 days. The routine was agonizingly simple. Madeline was kept in the cave, allowed out only twice a day under Jonah's cold stare. The tension in the camp was a tightly wound wire. Cass Boone was a coiled rattlesnake, his resentment toward Jonah growing with every hour he was denied his fun. Madeline's initial terror had subsided, replaced by a dull dread and a watchful, analytical mind. She was a teacher after all. She was an observer of human nature, and she was observing 2 men at war, Jonah Wade and Cass Boone. But it was Jonah who fascinated and terrified her. He was a paradox. He was a monster who treated her with a chilling, impersonal distance. Yet he protected her from Cass with a finality that was absolute. He was a leader who his men feared, yet he was a man who woke up screaming at ghosts. On the 3rd day, she was exploring the cramped confines of her prison. It wasn't just a cave, it was a dry storage larder, carved out by previous, unknown inhabitants. In the back, tucked into a crevice, her fingers brushed against something smooth. She pulled it out. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. A robin, perhaps. It was worn smooth, clearly held by a small hand for a very long time. It was so out of place, so achingly human in this place of violence, that it made her chest ache. She held it, its simple form a comfort in her palm. Later, Luke brought her water. He seemed more anxious than usual. "Mr. Luke," she said quietly, keeping her voice low. He froze. "Mom." She held out the wooden bird. "Do you know what this is?" Luke's face went white. He looked around wildly, as if Cass or Jonah might materialize from the shadows. Where did you get that?" "It was back there, in the crevice." "Put it back," he hissed, his voice tight with panic. Please, Mum, for God's sake, put it back. If he sees you with it—" "Who?" she pressed, though she already knew. "Captain Wade." Luke nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing. It was his girls." The words hung in the air. His girls. "His daughter?" Madeline whispered. Luke looked like he was about to bolt. "Her name was Sophie. She loved birds." He looked over his shoulder again. "He's not a bad man, Mum. Not always. The war, it did something to him. But it wasn't just the war." "What happened, Luke?" "He came home," Luke whispered, his voice cracking. "He came home from Appomattox a hero, but he was too late. While he was away, raiders, bushwhackers, they hit his farm, his wife, Anna, and his little girl, Sophie. He didn't need to finish." Madeline felt the blood drain from her face. "He found them," Luke continued, his eyes wet. "And something inside him just snapped. He's been hunting ever since. First he hunted the men who did it, then he just kept hunting. Cass Boone, he was one of those raiders. Jonah caught him, but instead of killing him, he recruited him. Said he needed men who understood the darkness." Luke shook his head. "He's not a man anymore, Mom. He's just a tombstone. Please, put the bird back." Luke fled, leaving Madeline alone in the twilight. She clutched the small wooden toy, the smooth wood now feeling heavy, weighted with an impossible grief. She understood. The emptiness in his eyes wasn't malice. It was absence. It was a hollowed-out space where a family used to be. That evening, she didn't wait for him to have a nightmare. When he sat by the fire, lost in his silent brooding, she walked out of the cave. Cass Boone, cleaning his rifle, looked up with a grin. Well, well, little birds leaving her cage. Jonah didn't even turn. "Get back in the cave, girl." "No," she said. The camp went silent. Dutch froze. Cass's grin widened. Jonah turned his head, his eyes narrowing to slits. She walked toward him, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped thing. She stopped a few feet away, holding out her hand. The small wooden bird sat on her palm. "You should keep this," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Not hide it in the dark." Jonah Wade looked at the bird, and for the first time, his mask of iron shattered. A raw, profound agony ripped across his features. He didn't look like a war chief. He looked like a father. "Where?" he choked out. "Did you get that?" "It was in the cave. Where you left it." He shot to his feet, his hand grabbing his revolver. "You have no right." "Her name was Sophie," Madeline said, and she hated that her voice was trembling. "She loved birds. Your wife was Anna." It was as if she had struck him. He staggered back a step, his face ashen. The revolver in his hand wavered. "Luke," he breathed, a promise of murder in the name. "It doesn't matter who told me," she said, stepping closer. "What matters is that you're not a tombstone. You're a father, and you're letting the men who took them from you win. You became them." "Shut up!" he roared, and the sound was so full of pain it was almost a sob. He raised the gun, his hand shaking violently. Cass Boone was on his feet, rifle ready, a look of ecstatic anticipation on his face. He was hoping Jonah would do it. Madeline looked at the gun, then back at Jonah's eyes. And she did the one thing he didn't expect. She didn't run. She didn't beg. She just cried. Tears, hot and silent, streamed down her face. Not for herself, not for her fear. She cried for him, for the man who had to come home to that, for the father who lost his Sophie, for the husband who lost his Anna, for the soul that was so completely and utterly lost. "I am so sorry," she wept, her voice breaking. "I am so sorry for what they took from you. No one should have to. She couldn't finish. She just stood there, weeping for his loss. Jonah Wade stared at her. His hand trembled. The gun felt heavy. He had seen women cry. He had heard them scream and beg. But he had never seen this. He had never seen empathy. He had expected fear, and he was met with a grief that mirrored his own. The gun lowered. His hand fell to his side. The rage, the ice, the entire fortress he had built around his heart. It didn't just crack. It collapsed. He looked at the small bird in her hand. He looked at her tears, and he saw, for the first time in 5 years, something other than the fire that had consumed his world. He snatched the bird from her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. "Go back to the cave," he said. But the voice was different. The iron was gone. It was just a man, raw and exposed. "Just go." He turned and walked away from the fire, away from his men, disappearing into the deep shadows of the canyon, clutching a small wooden bird to his chest. Cass Boone stared after him, his expression no longer amused. It was one of pure, calculating hatred. Jonah Wade was weak, and Cass knew, in that moment, that his time to take charge was coming. After that night, everything changed. Jonah Wade didn't speak to Madeline, but his actions were louder than any words. He moved his bedroll to the mouth of her cave, a silent, brooding guardian. He wasn't keeping her in. He was keeping Cass out. He brought her food and water himself. The hardtack was replaced with a share of the stew, and the water in the canteen was always fresh. When he handed it to her, he wouldn't meet her eyes, but his hand no longer lingered on her with that cold, impersonal grip. He recoiled as if burned. The shift was not lost on the rest of the gang. "Playing house, Captain," Cass taunted him across the fire the next evening. Jonah just cleaned his rifle, his movements economical and precise. "Mind your business, Boone." "She is my business," Cass snarled, getting to his feet. "She's our business. You're going soft. That lawman, Brody, is out there right now, and you're mooning over a piece of bait." "She's not bait anymore," Jonah said, his voice quiet. "What?" Jonah finally looked up. The deadness was gone, replaced by a weary, burning focus. "We're moving out at dawn. We're not waiting for Brody. We're heading west." "And the girl?" Cass demanded. We're letting her go. We'll leave her by the main trail, near Redemption Creek." Cass Boone laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. No, I don't think so. We took a risk grabbing her. We don't just give her up. I'm owed. We're owed." "You're owed nothing," Jonah said, standing up. He was taller than Cass, broader. "I'm still the leader of this outfit. We break camp at dawn. That's final." Cass held his gaze for a long moment, his eyes full of mutiny, but he hadn't prepared the others. Dutch looked confused, and Luke looked relieved. Cass, for now, was outmaneuvered. He spat into the fire. "Whatever you say, Captain." But the word was an insult. That night, a new crisis emerged. Madeleine, weakened by the ordeal and the harsh conditions, developed a fever. It started as a shiver, but by midnight she was trembling violently. Jonah, sleeping at the cave's entrance, heard her teeth chattering. He lit a lantern and found her huddled, her skin clammy and her eyes overly bright. I'm so cold," she whispered. He put his hand to her forehead. It was burning. He swore, a low, frustrated sound. He left and came back with his own bedroll, a thick, wool-lined blanket, and draped it over her. It wasn't enough. She was delirious, muttering about her students, about Missouri, about her father. Jonah sat on his heels, watching her, his face a complex mask of frustration and a new, unwelcome emotion, concern. He barked at Luke to build up the fire and boil water. "What's wrong with her?" Luke asked. "Fever. From the bad water, maybe. Or the cold." "We can't move her like this, Wade," Luke said. "She'll die on the trail." Jonah knew it. He was trapped by the lawman hunting him, by the snake in his own camp, and now by the failing health of his hostage. He spent the night tending to her. He forced water between her lips. He wiped her face with a wetted cloth. She was completely vulnerable, her life in his hands. In her delirium, she reached out and grabbed his wrist. Her eyes, unfocused, stared at him. You came back," she whispered, her voice rough. Jonah froze. "What?" "Sophie, she missed you." It was a knife in his heart. He tried to pull his hand away, but her grip, even in sickness, was surprisingly strong. "It's not your fault," she mumbled, her eyes drifting closed. The war. It's over, Captain. You can come home now. Anna is waiting." Jonah Wade stopped trying to pull away. He sat there, his wrist captured by the sick woman, and let the ghost of his wife's name wash over him. He bowed his head, his broad shoulders shaking, though he made no sound. The war chief was brought to his knees, not by a bullet, but by a fevered, forgiving whisper. He made a decision. He would not let her die. He didn't care about Brody. He didn't care about Cass. He would keep her alive. It was the first thing that had mattered, the first life that had mattered, in 5 long years. He didn't notice Cass Boone, watching from the shadows near the canyon wall. Cass saw the entire exchange. He saw the captain holding the girl's hand. He saw the bowed head. And he smiled. Jonah wasn't just soft. He was compromised, and Cass knew exactly how to use that. When dawn broke, Madeline's fever was worse. She was unresponsive, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. Jonah Wade was a man possessed. He barked orders at Luke. "Ride to the ridge. Keep watch for Brody. Dutch, get more firewood. We're not moving." "And me?" Cass asked, stepping out, a false solicitude on his face. "What can I do, Captain? Poor thing looks peaky." "You," Jonah snarled. "Stay the hell away from her." "Of course. But Wade, we're sitting ducks here. Brody's not a fool. He'll find this canyon." "I'll deal with Brody," Jonah said. "Will you? Or will you be too busy playing nursemaid?" Jonah's hand snapped to his gun, but he stopped. He couldn't. He couldn't kill Cass. Not because he was afraid, but because he was the only other good fighter he had. If Brody's posse rode in, he'd need every gun. Jonah was trapped between the law, the fever, and the mutiny. "Go take first watch," Jonah ordered, reining in his temper. "And Cass, if you see Brody, you fire 1 warning shot. You don't engage. Understood?" "Clear as crystal, Captain," Cass said with a mocking salute. He sauntered off, rifle in hand, toward the high trail that led out of the canyon. But Cass didn't go to the lookout point. He rode for 2 miles until he was well clear of the canyon, and then he dismounted. He pulled a small, greasy mirror from his saddlebag. He angled it toward the sun, flashing a signal. 3 short flashes, 1 long, toward a distant butte to the east. A minute later, an answering flash came. Cass Boone smiled. Sheriff Brody was exactly where Cass had told him he'd be. Cass had been leaving a trail of broken branches and carefully placed shell casings for days. He had made a deal with the law 2 days before the stagecoach robbery. He'd give them Wade, the infamous war chief, in exchange for a full pardon and the contents of the gang's lockbox. Brody had only one condition. The woman, Madeline Pryor, had to be brought out unharmed. Cass had agreed, but now the girl was a problem. She had made Wade human again. And Cass couldn't have that. He needed Wade to be the monster Brody was hunting. His new plan was simple. He would ride back, tell Jonah he saw nothing. He would let Brody's posse get into position. Then, right when the posse attacked, Cass would make his move. He'd kill Jonah himself, making it look like Brody's bullet. He'd kill the girl, too. He'd tell Brody she was caught in the crossfire. Tragic. He'd be the sole survivor, the hero who tried to save her. He'd get his pardon, the gold, and his freedom. He rode back to the canyon, his face a mask of loyal concern. He found Jonah kneeling by the fire, crushing some dried willow bark, a fever reducer, into a cup of water. "Anything?" Jonah asked, not looking up. "Nothing. The desert's quiet as a grave," Cass lied. "How's our patient?" "She's breathing easier," Jonah said. He gently lifted Madeline's head, pouring the bitter water into her mouth. She coughed, but she swallowed. "You're a natural at that, Wade," Cass said, his voice dripping with venom. "A real family man." Jonah ignored him. He was focused only on Madeline. He brushed a strand of damp hair from her face. That small, tender gesture was his death warrant. "I'm going to relieve Luke," Cass said. "Get some rest, Captain. You look like hell." Jonah just grunted, his attention fixed on the woman in his care. He didn't see the murderous, triumphant look in Cass Boone's eyes as he walked away. The trap was set. The attack came an hour after sundown. The first sign was a rifle shot from the ridge. But it wasn't a warning. It was the sharp crack of a marksman's bullet, and it slammed into Dutch, who was tending the horses. He collapsed without a sound. "Ambush!" Luke screamed from his post. Jonah Wade was instantly the soldier again. The grief, the tenderness. It all vanished, replaced by a cold, tactical focus. "Luke, to me! Cass, covering fire, north rim!" But Cass was already moving. He wasn't firing at the rim. He was running toward Jonah. "Brody's here, Wade!" Cass yelled. "He's got us pinned!" Men, the sheriff's posse, were appearing on the canyon rim, their rifles flashing in the twilight. Bullets began to rain down, chipping stone, tearing through bedrolls. Jonah grabbed Madeline, who was dazed and weak but awake from the gunfire. He half dragged, half carried her into the deepest part of the storage cave. "Stay down, no matter what you hear. You stay down," he commanded. He turned to leave, but she grabbed his arm. "Jonah!" He looked back. Her eyes were clear, the fever haze burned away by adrenaline. Don't die." He stared at her. The soldier and the man warring for a fraction of a second. He gave a sharp, curt nod and sprinted back into the fight. "Luke!" Jonah bellowed, taking cover behind a rock. "Where are they?" "Everywhere!" Luke yelled, firing his repeater. "He must have followed us." "Cass!" Jonah shouted. "Where's your fire?" Cass Boone appeared, not from the flank, but from behind Jonah. "Right here, Captain." Jonah turned. Cass was 10 feet away, his rifle leveled not at the posse, but at Jonah's chest. "You," Jonah breathed, the betrayal hitting him harder than any bullet. "You sold us out. You sold us out, Wade," Cass sneered. "You, with your ghosts and your guilt. You went soft. I'm just cleaning up the mess." "The stagecoach. You knew Brody was close," Jonah realized. "You wanted me to take the bait." "And you did," Cass laughed. "And now you'll die here. The girl too. Crossfire, you see. Sheriff Brody will be so very sad." Luke, seeing the standoff, screamed, "Jonah!" and raised his own rifle at Cass. Cass was faster. He pivoted and fired from the hip. The bullet caught Luke in the chest. The young man gasped, stumbled, and fell. The sight of Luke falling, the last member of his gang, the kid he'd tried to protect, broke the last leash on Jonah's control. He didn't just get angry. He became the war chief. He roared, a sound of pure primal fury, and dove forward, firing his Colt. He wasn't aiming to kill. Not yet. He was aiming to maim. His shot tore through Cass's shoulder, spinning him around. Cass screamed in pain and rage, firing wildly. The canyon erupted. Brody's men, seeing the outlaws fighting each other, advanced, scrambling down the rocks. Jonah ignored them. He was a storm of violence, closing the distance on Cass. He tackled him, and the two men went down in a brutal, rolling fight. Knives and fists and guns. It wasn't a duel. It was a slaughter. Jonah was stronger, fueled by 5 years of grief and a fresh wave of betrayal. He slammed Cass's head against the rocks, over and over. "You killed him!" Jonah roared, landing a blow that broke Cass's nose. Cass, bleeding and desperate, clawed for his fallen rifle. "She made you weak, Wade. He never finished. A new figure was there. Sheriff Brody, a tall man with a grim face and a star on his chest, stood over them, his shotgun leveled. "Wade, Boone, it's over." Jonah, breathing like a winded bull, looked up. He was surrounded. Brody's posse had them, but Cass wasn't done. With a final burst of adrenaline, he shoved Jonah off him, scrambled to his feet, and saw Madeline peeking from the cave. "If I'm dying," Cass shrieked, his face a mask of blood, "I'm taking your heart with me." He raised his revolver and fired at Madeline. Jonah Wade moved without thinking. He threw himself sideways, intercepting the bullet. It hit him high in the chest, a solid, tearing impact. He grunted, a sound of surprise, and collapsed to his knees. Madeline screamed. Cass Boone laughed, a wet, gurgling sound, and raised his gun to fire again. "No!" Jonah roared. From his knees, he raised his own Colt and fired. Once, twice. The bullet struck Cass center mass. The outlaw's eyes went wide. He looked down at the red blossoms on his shirt, then at Jonah. He crumpled and was still. The canyon fell silent, save for the sound of Jonah Wade, the broken war chief, collapsing onto the dust. Madeline ran from the cave, ignoring the guns of the posse. She fell to her knees beside him, pressing her hands to the wound. It was bad. So much blood. "No, no, no," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Jonah, stay with me. You don't get to die. Do you hear me? You don't get to leave." Jonah looked up at her. The pain was immense, but his eyes were clear. The ghosts were gone. The war was finally over. He saw her. Just her. He tried to speak. "Shh! Save your strength," she cried. "Sophie," he whispered, his voice a thread. "She's beautiful." His eyes closed. "He's losing too much blood," Madeline screamed at the sheriff. "Help him, please. He saved my life. He saved me." Sheriff Brody looked at the scene. The dead gang, the bleeding outlaw, and the weeping woman clinging to him. He sighed, holstering his weapon. "Get the wagon, boys," he said, his voice weary. "And the medicine kit. It seems we're taking a prisoner, and he'd better live, because I want to hear this story from the beginning." Jonah Wade didn't die. The bullet from Cass Boone's gun had torn through his chest, a devastating wound that should have been fatal in the desolate canyon. But Sheriff Brody, seeing the raw, desperate plea in Madeline's eyes and the complexity of the scene before him, had made a decision. "He's a prisoner of the territory," Brody had declared, "and he'll stand trial. That means he stands alive." The journey to Redemption Creek was an agonizing blur for Jonah. He was strapped to a wagon, drifting in a red-hazed world of pain. The only constant was a voice, sometimes sharp and commanding, sometimes a soft, distant murmur, and a hand, a cool hand on his brow, a steady hand forcing water past his cracked lips. He was housed not in the jail cell, but in the small two-bed infirmary above it. Dr. Silas, the town's weary, overworked physician, had looked at the wound, probed it, and shaken his head. "The bullet passed through," he told Madeline, "but it took a lot with it. There's fever. The infection. Mum, I've seen younger, healthier men die from less." "He will not die," Madeline stated. It was not a request. It was a command. The town of Redemption Creek didn't know what to make of her. She was the new school marm, the victim of a brutal kidnapping. But she was also the dedicated nurse to the man who had kidnapped her. Mrs. Gable, who ran the local hotel, had offered her the finest room, free of charge. Madeline had refused, opting for a simple wooden chair by Jonah's bedside. For 2 weeks, she waged a quiet war. She cleaned the seeping wound. She boiled willow bark for his fever. She spooned thin broth into his mouth when he was lucid, and when he thrashed in the throes of delirium, crying out for Anna, for Sophie, for men she didn't know, she would grip his hand. "It's over, Jonah," she would whisper, her voice firm. "The war is over. You are here. You are safe." She was, she realized, not just tending his body. She was tending the broken, hollowed-out ruin of his soul, coaxing it back from the brink. The people of the town watched her, their fear of the war chief in the cell below slowly being replaced by a profound curiosity, and then a quiet respect for the woman in the room above. On the 14th day, the fever broke. Jonah Wade woke to the scent of soap and the feel of clean cotton sheets. The roaring in his ears was gone. The red haze was gone. He turned his head, a sharp pain reminding him of his body, and saw her. She was asleep in the chair, her head resting on her arms, folded on the edge of his cot. Her auburn hair, which he'd only ever seen matted with dust and fear, was clean, catching the morning light. In repose, she looked exhausted, but peaceful. He watched her for a long time, the weight of his actions settling on him. He was a kidnapper, a killer, an outlaw. He had taken this woman, dragged her into his personal hell, and used her as bait. And in return, she had fought for his life with a ferocity he hadn't seen since the war. He tried to sit up, but the movement sent a jolt of pain through him, and he let out a low, involuntary groan. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, instantly alert. They stared at each other, the patient and the nurse, the captive and the captor. "Jonah," she said, her voice soft with sleep. "Madeline," he replied. His own voice was a hoarse, alien rasp. A small, tired smile touched her lips. "Welcome back." He looked down at the thick white bandages swathing his chest. He could feel the heavy, stitched pull of the wound. The shot," he managed. "It was meant for me," she said, her voice perfectly level, all traces of sleep gone. "You took it." There was nothing else to say. He looked away from the quiet intensity of her gaze, ashamed, and, for the first time in more years than he could count, profoundly grateful. He had saved her life. But she, in every way that mattered, had just saved his. The trial of Jonah Wade was the most significant event in the county's history. The small courtroom was packed to bursting. Men stood 3 deep along the back wall, their hats in their hands, the air thick with sweat and anticipation. Jonah sat at the defense table, his arm in a sling, his face gaunt. His lawyer, Mr. Owens, was a young, earnest man, appointed by the court, who looked overwhelmed. The prosecutor, Mr. Garrett, was the opposite. He was a slick, ambitious man from Santa Fe, and he saw in Jonah Wade a chance to build his reputation. "This man," Garrett boomed in his opening statement, jabbing a finger at Jonah, "is not just a man. He is a plague, a sickness that has preyed on this territory. They call him the War Chief, a name bought with the blood of good men. He and his gang of cutthroats have robbed and murdered their way across 3 counties, and his final, most heinous act was to kidnap that poor, defenseless woman," he motioned to Madeline, who sat in the front row, "and drag her into his den of thieves." The testimony was damning. Sheriff Brody was the first to take the stand. He was a factual, no-nonsense man. He recounted the ambush, the discovery of Dutch and young Luke's bodies. "And what did you witness in the final moments, Sheriff?" Garrett asked. "I saw the outlaw, Cassidy Boone, betray his leader," Brody said, his voice clear. "I saw them fight. I saw Boone break free and raise his weapon at Miss Pryor, who was unarmed." "And what did the defendant do?" "He moved," Brody said simply. "He threw himself in front of her, took the bullet." Mr. Garrett waved this away. "A last-second act of something. It does not erase the blood on his hands." Then Madeline was called to the stand. A hush fell over the room. She walked with a steady grace, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked not at the prosecutor, nor the judge, but at Jonah. He met her gaze, his own full of a weary dread. Mr. Garrett was gentle at first. "Miss Pryor, this man, Jonah Wade, he took you from that stagecoach against your will, did he not?" "Yes, sir." "He threatened you. He dragged you into the Badlands." "Yes, sir." "You were at all times in fear for your life and your honor." Madeline hesitated. "I was in fear, but not always from him." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Please, Mum, just answer the question. Were you his prisoner?" "Yes." Garrett smiled, turning to the jury. "Thank you, Miss Pryor. No further questions." It was Mr. Owens's turn. The young lawyer stood, shuffling his papers. "Miss Pryor," he began, his voice shaky, "you said you were not always in fear of my client. Can you elaborate?" "The other man," Madeline said, her voice gaining strength. "Cassidy Boone. He was the evil in that camp. He was cruel. He wanted to harm me. He made no secret of it." "And the defendant, Mr. Wade?" "He stopped him," she said simply. "He protected me. He moved his bedroll to the mouth of my cave to keep Cass out. He was not the same man." "What do you mean he was not the same man? Did something change?" Madeline took a deep breath. This was it. She looked at the jury, at the judge. "He is a man haunted by a grief I cannot imagine," she said. "His wife and daughter were murdered while he was at war. He is a broken man. I found a small toy, a wooden bird that belonged to his daughter." Jonah squeezed his eyes shut. He bowed his head, his shoulders tensing. "When I showed it to him," Madeline continued, her voice thick with an empathy that silenced the room, "I saw the man he was. The father, the husband, the soldier, not the outlaw. And I saw that man make a choice. He chose to let me go. He chose to turn his back on the violence. It was Cass Boone who refused. It was Cass Boone who betrayed him and set the trap. It was Cass Boone who was the monster." "Objection," Garrett shouted. "The witness is speculating. She's painting this killer as a saint." "Sustained," the judge banged his gavel. "Miss Pryor, stick to the facts." "The fact," Madeline said, her eyes flashing, her voice ringing with indisputable truth, "is that when Cass Boone raised his gun to murder me, Jonah Wade did not hesitate. He did not run. He did not bargain. He saved my life. He placed his body between me and the bullet." She turned to the jury, her face a mask of conviction. "He is guilty of kidnapping me. He is guilty of robbery. But he is not the monster Mr. Garrett describes. He is a man who lost his way in a grief too terrible to bear. And in that canyon, he found it again. He found his honor. and he paid for it with his own blood. Do not let Cass Boone win today. Do not let him kill this man too," she finished. The courtroom was utterly, profoundly silent. Jonah Wade did not move, his head still bowed, but a single tear cut a clean path through the dust on his cheek. It took the jury 4 hours. The tension was unbearable. Madeline sat in the front row, refusing to leave. The foreman, a rancher, read the verdict. On the charge of kidnapping, guilty. On the charge of robbery, guilty. On the charge of murder. Jonah braced himself. Not guilty. A wave of murmurs. The judge silenced them. However, the foreman continued, in light of the defendant's documented war service, the mitigating circumstances of his loss, and his ultimate, selfless actions in saving the life of Miss Pryor at the cost of his own, we, the jury, unanimously recommend mercy from this court. The judge, a stern man named Peterson, looked over his spectacles at Jonah for a long, hard minute. "Jonah Wade," he said, his voice gravelly, "you have lived a life of violence. You took the law into your own hands, and in doing so, you became the very thing you sought to destroy. The law is clear. But mercy," he nodded toward Madeline, "is also a cornerstone of justice. This court does not condone your actions, but it recognizes your redemption. I sentence you to 20 years in the territorial prison at Yuma." The gavel fell like a gunshot. 20 years. Not hanging. It was life. 20 years is an eternity. It's enough time for a territory to become a state, for a dusty street to gain wooden sidewalks and a telegraph office. It's enough time for a school marm to become the most respected woman in the county, the head of the school board, her auburn hair now a graceful, shining silver. Madeline Pryor never married. She stayed in Redemption Creek. She built her school and her life from the ground up. And once a month, for 20 years, she wrote a letter. The first letters were stiff. She wrote of the town. He wrote of the stone walls. As the years passed, she wrote of her students, of the books she was reading, of the changing seasons. He wrote back. He wrote about his past, the farm, the war. He wrote about Anna and Sophie. It took him 7 years to write the words, "I am sorry." It took her only a single day to write back, "I know. You are forgiven." They built a friendship, a strange, powerful bond on 2 decades of paper and ink. On a bright, clear autumn morning, the massive iron gates of the Yuma Territorial Prison groaned open. A man walked out, squinting into the sunlight. He was in his late 50s, his beard entirely grey, his face a map of lines carved by the sun and by time. The war-dressed was long dead and buried. This was just Jonah. He carried a single, small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He walked to the train station, his movements stiff but steady. She was waiting on the platform, just as she said she would be. She looked older, but her back was straight, and her eyes, when they met his, were the same. They held the same quiet strength that had faced him down in a dark cave. He stopped a few feet away from her. The noise of the station, the steam, the shouting porters, faded to a dull roar. 20 years of words on paper, and now, in person, there was only silence. "You came," he said, his voice rough. "I said I would," she replied. He fumbled with the bundle in his hands. He unwrapped the cloth. In his calloused palm, worn as smooth as a river stone, from 2 decades of being held every single night, was a small wooden bird. Madeline's eyes softened. "You kept it." "It was all I had," he whispered. "No, Jonah," she said, stepping closer. She placed her hand over his, closing his fingers around the bird. "It's what you rebuilt." He looked at their hands, his large and scarred, hers small but strong. He swallowed, the weight of the moment, of his past and this impossible future threatening to overwhelm him. Madeline. I don't know. I do. She cut him off gently, a small smile on her face. She held out her other hand to him. It's time to come home. He looked at her outstretched hand, then at her face. The war was over. The prison was behind him. The ghosts were silent. He took her hand, and together they walked toward the train. The line between a monster and a man can be as thin as a single act of kindness. Jonah Wade was a man destroyed by war and loss, rebuilt by the empathy of a woman he had taken captive. Their story proves that even in the deepest darkness, a heart can be rebuilt, and that redemption isn't just about being forgiven, it's about becoming worthy of it. This was a story of survival, sacrifice, and the incredible power of a single person's tears to wash away a lifetime of war. If this story of finding humanity in the most unlikely of places touched your heart, please help us share it. Like this video, share it with someone who loves a powerful drama, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories just like this one. Your support lets us keep telling them. Thank you for listening.